Welcome to today's episode of EUROMED Migration Talks, a web series dedicated to migration in the Euro-Mediterranean region, run by the EUROMED Migration 4 project implemented by ICMPD. I'm your host, Marco Ricorda, and today I will be accompanied by Maria Pisani, Senior Lecturer at the University of Malta and the co-founder and director of the Integra Foundation. Maria, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Not so bad. And I'd like to ask you a few questions about your work and your research. Now, something that fascinated me about some of your publication is that in your research, you often use the expression Homo migratus to speak about migration as a natural phenomenon, arguing that human beings have always migrated and always will be. However, over the last few years, the public debate seems to focus mainly on the negative side of migration. Now, what are your thoughts on that?
The term Homo migratus was something that I came up with in a moment of boredom, in truth, but it was to capture an incredibly important point. And that is that as long as human beings have walked on this earth, we have migrated. We are all the produce, the product of migration. So this is nothing new. And I think it helps to frame the conversation around the hugely diverse ways people migrate. Also, I think I'd like to start by challenging the notion of problem as well. Perhaps we can speak about the challenges that arise as a result of migration, again, couched within a much broader context as well, rather than problems per se.
Very good. And those on the move are arguably the key, as we say in Latin, dramatis persona in this so-called crisis. And yet, their voices are often absent in dominant representations of it. Now, what would be your advice to ensure the heterogeneity of their stories could have a place in the debate? What would you recommend?
Okay, so Marco, you're focusing, I think, on a particular movement when you use the term crisis. I think you're referring perhaps to the Mediterranean region specifically.
That's correct.
Because obviously the issue of migration is much, much broader than that. But most of my work has focused on the Mediterranean region and the central Mediterranean route in particular. The question of crisis, though, is an interesting one. If you look at the loss of life, the avoidable loss of life in the Mediterranean, yes, I'd say there is a humanitarian crisis, but an avoidable one. At the end of the day, people cross the Mediterranean Sea because they have no safe or legal alternative. So I think it's important that we acknowledge this from the start off. In terms of voice and representation, as you rightly highlight, we can talk of mixed flows, but I think in real terms, different people migrate and different people are forced to move for different reasons. And to homogenize the experience and the people that are traveling on the boats would be a huge mistake. Ongoing research has demonstrated the diverse experiences, but also common experiences as well. In terms of representation and voice, this has always been a challenge for me personally as Maria. The risk in representing people and speaking on behalf of people who are crossing the Mediterranean, well, it comes with responsibilities. And I always feel when I speak, I have to be very careful not to recolonize voices. But the reality also is that when people are dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis and experiencing, if they're on a boat, then they cannot speak on their behalf, which means that others with a huge sense of responsibility have to speak on their behalf. In our work in Malta, we have tried to engage the refugee population and other migrants in Malta so that they might become a part of that conversation or be at the front of that conversation as soon as they are ready, and we provide as much support in order to see this through. Obviously, in terms of having voice, it also if I was to use the words of Spivak, it is not just will I be heard, but not just who has the right to speak, but also who will be heard. And so it means in our work as an academic and also as an activist in working with a number of different stakeholders, from policymakers to faith leaders to the media, to ensure that refugees' voices are heard in the very diverse platforms where they need to be heard, and that their voices are given importance.
Very good. Now let's talk also about citizenship. In your research, you often discuss the role of citizenship in the migration debate, speaking about citizenship as a state-sanctioned form of discrimination and evoking the place of the rights to rights in the discussion. Now, could you explain what you mean in using these terms?
I come from a background in sociology of education, and when you're working in migration, this might seem an obvious thing, but given my background, I became very aware of two issues. First of all, that we celebrate democracy as if it's uncritically, I would say, and we almost assume that everyone has the right to rights. I mean, why wouldn't we? This is the narrative that we've learned from day one. And it's only when you're working with migrants, particularly refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented migrants, that you begin to recognize not only the limitations of citizenship, but also the limitations of human rights, where ultimately human rights are trumped by, if you'll excuse the term, by citizenship rights. It's interesting, just recently I was looking at the history of voting rights in Malta, and it was just over 70 years ago that women were given the right to vote in Malta, and I believe 150 years ago, not long ago at all, the vast majority of men couldn't vote in Malta either, and there was a whole set of criteria. So we can look at the issue of citizenship first and foremost as, yes, exclusionary, because not everybody is able to participate in what is ultimately one of the most important decision-making processes in any given nation state, but also how the rights that we take for granted as citizens are denied to those people that are also denied citizenship. Now, I'm speaking from Malta, where it is incredibly difficult for some people to be able to get citizenship. And yet at the same time, we also sell citizenship. So citizenship becomes a commodity. Human rights have become a commodity. So I think it's hugely important that we raise questions and take certain terms that are, again, that I think we have learned to be uncritical, to take a very critical approach. Always recognizing the historical perspective and how what we might assume to be natural and taken for granted today does have a historical legacy and has evolved over time. So even where we see resistance to giving migrants or some migrants voting rights, well, there was the same resistance to women having voting rights and the same resistance to men, historically, recent history, having voting rights too.
Talking about the importance of terms, I mean, there is an increasing negative and emotionally charged rhetoric around the term migrant. It's a term that raises attention on the use of labels, as of course labels can have a significant impact on the construction of the discourse. Very often, the mainstream public doesn't differentiate between migrant, asylum seeker, or refugee. Now, in your opinion, how important is the use of terminology in the migration debate?
Well, language is obviously very important and evolving. as well, and different people use language in different ways. So again, we can look at how the term migrant has evolved historically. If I look at Malta, we were historically a country of emigration. The majority of Maltese people have family members living abroad. These were migrants. But when we use the term migrant in this sense, from a Maltese perspective, it's not deemed as problematic. We can use other terms such as expats that tend to be celebrated. And then the term immigrant. I differentiate in Malta between immigrant and migrant. And the term immigrant or immigrant has become synonymous with illegality, crime, the need to defend. And this is hugely problematic. I like to refer to securitization theories, and we can look at how language has been used in a very particular way to construct the notion of invasion, of threat, and of threat by the other. And we can also look at how this other is also couched within a historical racialized discourse that has become very dangerous, because language feeds into lived realities, and people die as a result. People are illegally detained as a result. People are living incredibly difficult lives as a result of the language that some people knowingly choose to use, because this isn't an accident. This is an intentional strategy, if you like. So terms such as illegal, threat, invasion, they create fear, they construct fear, and this breeds division and violence in many forms.
Now, my last question for you today is it's about communication. So your involvement in the field provides you with an opportunity to keep the, let's say, the dialectic relationship between theory and practice alive. Building on your experience, what is your advice to promote a better dialogue between academia and migration practitioners, so those who make actually migration policy?
Well, I mean, ultimately, research provides the evidence base. Academics can provide the evidence base, and research, especially when we again, if we look at the broader context and the language that is being used and the passions, if you like, it's visceral. The conversations around migration are visceral. And so the need for, yes, emotional debate, but an evidence-based debate it comes to the fore. And I think academia has an incredibly important role in this regard, to cut through the noise, if you like, and to look at the different perspectives. I always take the refugee perspective and the migrant perspective to the fore, but to look at the different voices and the different stakeholders involved, and to sit down and dialogue and embrace the uncomfortable conversations. They are uncomfortable conversations, but they are unavoidable.
Maria Pisani, thank you very much for staying with us today. It was a real pleasure to talk to you about this very sensitive and modern topic, and we wish you all the best for the continuation of your work.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
To all our followers, you can watch this episode also on all our social networks, on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. And I'll see you again next week for the next episode of EUROMED Migration Talks. Thank you very much.